who is the senior newsroom editor. And correct me if that title has changed to news director or
interim news director, but yes.
Interim news director, yes.
Right.
So today's hot topic is going to be kind of a little lesson in information and information integrity and understanding some of the decisions or our own critical thinking skills on how we decipher what we are hearing from multiple news resources that we have. If you're like me, I've got Twitter, Facebook, posts, Instagram, a number of newspapers that I read on a daily basis. And then there's the conversations with some people that sometimes are only loosely based in fact. So we're excited to hear from Chaz with WPLN on how we can sharpen our skills and learn to look at the news a little more critically and help us with our civic engagement and help others increase their ability to tell fact from fiction. So I'll turn it over to you, Chaz. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's a lot to cover. I will say that I've mostly focused what I want to talk about on just the question of bias. And are you at the moment, you're seeing my are you seeing my screen's PowerPoint? Is that correct?
Yes,
I see some nods. Great. All right. Well, let me start a slideshow here and get us going. Still seeing it? Yep. And are you seeing the slideshow or are you seeing my screen of the slideshow?
We're seeing presentation mode. So slide presentation. So it's good.
Okay, good. So you're not seeing the back end. Okay, great. So yeah, as I believe it was Melissa, is that correct, that introduced me? Yeah, Melissa said I am the senior editor and interim news director here at WPLN. I have been with the station for about 8 years now. Actually, my anniversary date was yesterday, 8 years at the station. Before that, I was a newspaper reporter for many years, about 16 years. And I covered the state legislature here in Tennessee for 10 years, the General Assembly, before becoming an editor in 2018. I've been the senior editor since 2018, and I've been the interim news director since about mid-August. And what that basically means is that I'm the top editor here in the WPLN newsroom at the moment. So I do want to say thanks to you all for inviting me here to speak to you. This is kind of a new role for me to be doing these kind of presentations, so bear with me if I seem a little nervous or disorganized. And also, I do want to keep things fairly short. I timed this out to about 15 minutes. In radio, if we get even half that much time, we think it's a lot of time. So, and I did try to keep it focused to this one topic, which is bias. And then we can talk about some of the literacy things a little bit later. We'll just start with this question of what is bias. And I thought this was a nice way of summarizing it. This is an author I wasn't very familiar with, but I do know that he got to start in small town newspapers. So he knows a bit about media bias. And it's this, I think the important thing here is that the eye sees what the mind is prepared to comprehend. And I think that's a lot of what goes wrong in terms of when people are trying to understand the news, is that they're just not ready to comprehend what it is that they're seeing. They've got their own feelings coming in. And, I've been doing this for 20 years plus, and I will say I've never really seen like a comprehensive list of bias. So I did just kind of work off the 5 forms that Melissa listed for us, because it's a pretty comprehensive list. And you may have some more of your own that you may think of, but in case you can't see this, these forms of bias are partisan bias, corporate bias, big story bias, neutrality bias, and demographic bias. And I'm going to go through each of these over the next few minutes. One of the things I want to say at the top, and this is actually a very controversial thing in journalism, is that I do believe that eliminating forms of bias can and should be our role as journalists. I think that's what separates journalists from other people who write about the news for a living. And that may or may not seem controversial to you. I will say that many people in journalism think it's controversial because they just don't think that it's possible to eliminate bias, or that and since it's not possible, that it shouldn't be the goal. And the thinking behind this is that being unbiased is simply a way of preserving the majority point of view, that there's a certain way of looking at the world that the people who run newsrooms have, and that when they say they're unbiased, really they're just biased in their own way. And that's, I think, at the root of this quote here by Nathan Robinson at The Guardian. And what he suggests is that, if we make our political leanings more transparent, people will see us as more trustworthy. And I think that's an interesting, intriguing idea, but here's the problem with it. Now, this is a survey that was done last year of Americans' trust in media. And it basically, I think there are even more organizations than this, ranks them from most trustworthy to least trustworthy. And, you see the Weather Channel is at the top here, the BBC, PBS, you see NPR, this actually does pretty well. That's the network that, of course, we're part of. And as you go on down, we're tied here with CBS, the AP, which is really pretty good. Go down a little bit further, you see the Guardian. So that's where his publication is. And actually, I kind of am skeptical of this +4 on trust. I think it's probably low awareness of what the Guardian is. It's actually a very partisan organization. But certainly it's a lot lower than the BBC, their competitor up there at +24. And then you see here at the bottom, these are the organizations that lean into their bias the most. They're ones that are most opinionated. And, I think the result kind of speaks for itself. If you're saying that by being more openly partisan, more openly biased towards one party or the other, you're going to make yourself more trustworthy. I mean, this study of trustworthiness shows that that's really not the case. So I kind of want to think about another model on this, and this is something I've given a lot of thought up to, and that's that, journalists need to be professional, and they need to be thought of. The professionalism in journalism is about trying to eliminate bias, and the analogy I draw with this is to a lawyer. We don't think that a lawyer has to agree with us to give us good legal advice. We especially don't think a defense attorney has to feel that their client is absolutely innocent to give a vigorous defense. What we do, we actually expect them to do this as part of their role in our constitutional system. And similarly, we don't expect a doctor to necessarily approve of every choice we make, or even to have an opinion on our lives to give us good medical advice. We want them to be professional and just tell us what the facts are and what the science is, and then make up our minds for ourselves. And I think that is something that we can expect out of journalists too. There's no reason to expect that journalists can't be professionals in this way. And that's really, that is what professionalism is all about in my mind. So you do think that, I want to say there are some values that drive good journalism, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about these a little bit later, but these are some of the ones that I thought of off the top of my head: honesty, integrity, accountability, fairness, openness. And I think these are things that we all want for the news organizations that we trust. And here at WPLN, we've kind of distilled these things into this statement of principles. It's really for everyone in the organization, not just us in the newsroom, but I do think it reflects this idea of accountability, of being truthful, of being open, of being respectful to our audience. And, I think a lot of times when people are accusing journalists of a partisan point of view, I think a lot of times what they're really upset with are the facts themselves. They're saying they just don't want, they're not at their mind is not in the place to perceive what the eye has in front of it. So that is, that's where I think a lot of the partisan bias comes in. The second form of bias that we talked about a little bit earlier is corporate bias. And I think what we're referring to here is the idea that journalists are just doing a story because their corporate bosses want them to. And it's something I've definitely heard. I think I said earlier, I worked in newspapers before I came here. I was at the Tennessean for many years, worked for Gannett. There's always this accusation that we were doing stories to please the shareholders, to please the advertisers, that kind of thing. I hear it a little bit less here at WPLN in public media, but you do certainly hear that from time to time. And I will say that, like, in no place that I've ever been have I really encountered that type of corporate bias. I don't think that any journalist would do this work, certainly not on a professional, ongoing, high level, if they were being told what kind of stories to do. I do think there is a different type of corporate bias that is a little more insidious, and that is and this is that a lot of what we do, a lot of the people who come into journalism do have a middle class or upper middle class worldview. And I think that is something that's very much part of the business of journalism. That's very much part of the people who go in, of just, it's part of our culture, really, when you get down to it. And, as I said at the beginning, one of the real critiques of being non-biased is that it reflects the majority viewpoint. And this, being in a capitalist society, that is something that we all do to some degree, at least are aware of or reflect in some way. And journalists can be, they do tend to be educated. We do make a decent living. We do have healthcare benefits. It can be very easy to forget those that are less fortunate than us, and to assume that whatever our view is of economic matters, that's the rest of the world. And that's a little bit tougher form of bias to fight. But I do think it is something we can fight. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. so yeah, actually move on here. The third thing about performance bias we talked about was this big story bias. And that is one that I think that for-profit, particularly for-profit outlets can be guilty of. And, there's this, especially in the corporate world, there is this push for page views. And so sometimes you'll see this with celebrity news that doesn't really make sense being put front and center, just trying to jump in on the day's big story. And even our organization, we need to be responsive to that. Then I'm using this example here of the deep freeze that we had over Christmas. This was something where, we saw this as a big story. We knew we needed to be on top of it. To some degree, maybe we overdid it. There's always that accusation that we're overdoing it. But a story like that, it's like there is an important aspect of it to be covered. It's a story that I think we have an obligation to cover. And I think it often will create some really great questions. For covering the big story correctly, we'll have these kind of stories here where our environmental reporter was able to peel back some of the decisions that TVA made that maybe created some of these rolling blackouts. And I think that is part of what our obligation is as journalists. And while sort of like pointing to this may seem like a sort of a straw man type of thing, it is a bit of a straw man to talk about this particular thing. But I think that what big story bias really is about us as journalists, emphasizing the wrong stories. And whereas this one, I do think is one that we all agree was right. There are a lot of gray areas where people do sort of say you're overdoing it, and that's something that can be. I think it can be fair, and I think we could. I'm going to talk a little bit later, again, as I did with corporate bias, how to fight that. The next form of bias I want to talk about was neutrality bias, and to do that, I want to start by going back to this quote by Nathan Robinson and go back to the part that I glossed over a little bit earlier, and that's this. This part here that sort of sets up the part that I objected to a little bit earlier, which is that we all have moral instincts and points of view. And that is very true. And I think this is the thing that people say we need to lean into partisan bias. This is the thing that they're really trying to fight against, is neutrality bias. And the problem with being neutral, the problem with being non-biased is that it can be flipped on its head very quickly, and it can become a cudgel to try to keep people to silence people's different points of view. We give both sides of the argument in a way that, starts to, as I said, starts to silence people. So to kind of illustrate what I mean by this, and that is to want to point to this just one issue in particular, which is trans care. It's an emerging field, so there's a lot of complexity to it. A lot of people are just coming to understand it. They're understanding the pros and some of the cons. They go along with it, making decisions about what age people need to be when they start it. And there's a lot of debate over this in the medical community. This article here, The Battle Over Gender Therapy, was one I found quite illuminating when I read it over the summer. And we want to explore this complexity as journalists, but we don't want to do it in a way that encourages both siderism. And because there's not equality in different points of view. And I think the way to sort of if you do, as I said, keep pushing neutrality to this extreme, it just becomes a cudgel, to certain points of view. And I always think of this here, the old, if you know it, you remember it, the point counterpoint on Saturday Night Live, where Jane Curtin would give her point of view, and then, Dan Aykroyd's response was just an insult, and that's the trap that it can kind of come into, is where what's happens is that instead of people being treated by our core values, which are honesty, openness, things that I think we as a society want to promote, and we as journalists want to promote, is that we allow those core values to be violated in the interest of neutrality. And I don't think that we have an obligation to give every point of view the same weight. We may want to acknowledge and we want to reflect it, but we don't have an obligation to give every point of view the same weight in society. So that brings us to the fifth form of bias. And this is really what I think we've been talking about all along. The fifth form of bias is diversity bias. And I think really more what we mean here is a lack of diversity to bias. And I think that's what underlines a lot of these other forms. So if you think about partisan bias, it's kind of a form of groupthink. It occurs when there's just not enough people in the newsroom giving their points of view, so that all points of view are given a chance to be heard in a publication. Think about corporate bias. As I said, it's maybe a form of classicism, where people just don't understand the circumstances of others, the economic circumstances of others. Big story bias is a form of alienation. It's a disconnection from the community, so not really knowing what the community wants. And the neutrality bias is this lack of empathy. And it arises when the decision makers in the newsroom just aren't aware of the stakes behind a story. And I think the solution to all that is to diversify. It's to be a more diverse newsroom. So this slide here, it's from the latest survey of public radio, public media. And it's an initial comparison here. You know, it's a problem. Diversity has always been a big problem in public radio. It's probably one of the most white sectors of media. And you can see that here. I mean, the minority population in the US is 40%. In radio, it's less than 20%. If you look at, another way of putting that is 80% Caucasian. It's also true of the leadership. People like me, more than 90% of us are white. And this has been a hard thing to fight over the years. And you can see the result of that in the ratings. This is actually our most recent ratings as a station, WPLN. Nashville's 23% Black, and only about 6% of our audience in December was Black. And on a good month, it's about 12%. So we're looking at, you know, probably half of where we need to be as an organization that really reflects in our listenership, the community. And we don't do a lot better with Latino audiences either. And I think that for me, the feeling on this is, you know, is that what we're doing is we're creating this negative feedback loop where people are not hearing themselves on the radio. We're not doing stories that resonate with people in these communities. And then as a result, they're not listening. And it just becomes this thing of like people don't come into the business of radio as much as they do in TV and newspapers because they haven't heard themselves reflected in the past. And an eye-opening moment for me as a journalist, like what I can do differently, was just before I became an editor in 2018. I was covering the legislature. It was my last session at the legislature. And there was a bill being debated that dealt with immigrants who are not documented. And I don't remember the specifics. It was, I think it had something to do with driver's licenses, which can't be issued to undocumented immigrants anyway. And to me, it didn't feel like it had a major impact. It had not been a focus for me during the session. But there was a person on staff who whose parents had been undocumented, and sort of at a slow moment in the session towards the end, I sent her a copy of the bill, asked her thoughts, and she had some immediate reactions like, okay, this is why this is problematic. It was not something I was really aware of. And that's because of just where my point of view was, my privilege from that point of view. And so when I became an editor a few months later, I very consciously wanted to have someone of color in that position, because at that time, the press corps at the Capitol was all white. You know, all my colleagues there were white, and we just were not seeing the same things as other people. And so, you know, so since then we have always had a person of color covering the legislature, and that's something that I think is important to bring people into covering political coverage, which has been an area that's been particularly white in the past, and diversifying the number of the people who are in that field. And one of the compliments that I'm most proud of at WPLN is that when people talk about the diversity of our sound, we've got a lot of different accents, a lot of different people from a lot of different places. And there has been this idea on radio for a long time that you have to have a particular voice if you want to be a radio reporter. And there are some people for whom they do have that voice, and it's a real gift. This is Blake Farmer. I see some smiles of recognition. Even my brother in Atlanta wants to know if I work with Blake Farmer. And I tell him, yes, he's actually reports to me. I'm his boss. But yeah, just that you have this gift, and so a lot of us don't even apply for radio jobs. It was not something I was even thinking of going into when I came out of college, because I don't have a radio voice, and that helps create that loop of like people not hearing stories about themselves. So the way to deal with this is to hire journalists of color, is to empower them to make decisions. I think us as a newsroom, we've done pretty well in this area. 6 of our current editors are people of color. 1 person's Black, 2 people identify as Latino or Hispanic. And that's a good step. But I think also what's even more powerful is when we bring people in to our station, listening to them as reporters, as interns, just to listen to their ideas. The woman I mentioned earlier, actually, when she gave me that feedback, she was an intern at the station. And so, we're hiring people to bring us fresh perspectives, and we have to expect that they're going to do that. And so this is one story I'm particularly proud of. This is a reporter named Damon Mitchell, who is Black, and came to me during our weekly one-on-ones and said he wanted to do a story about Cashville, which is this nickname for Nashville that's very popular in the hip hop community. You know, what does it mean? Where does it come from? It was actually a pretty nebulous idea, and he didn't really know exactly what he wanted to do with it. And I was just sort of told him, look, find me a story. I think it's a great idea. It's not a story anyone has done. I've never heard anyone do anything on Cashville ever. I see it all over the place, even though I don't know anything about Nashville hip hop. And so you end up with this story here, and I'm going to play about a minute of it for you, which I think really, I think illustrates what I'm talking about. Are you having trouble hearing? Are you able to hear? Are you able to hear or not? No, not able to hear. I may have. I'm sorry. I may have made a mistake when I shared on not sharing the sound properly. I apologize. Anyway, I'll just move on. So basically what this is it says, and I'm sorry you can't hear it, but he's talking about the history of this name, talking about how it connects to 1990s hip hop culture, which was kind of a hustle era. It was like people like Jay-Z were big, talking about sort of the importance of making money, getting ahead, that kind of thing. And, really turned into this like real nice meditation on like what it means to succeed in Nashville, how that's evolved over the years and how prosperity, how much it's been distributed to Nashville. And during this whole time of its city, it's always been very much around, the downtown and places like that. And maybe some of these brands and things that are less connected to that, have they gotten the attention that they should? So anyway, and it's, I thought it was just a really nice kind of, as I said, a meditation on this nickname. And, as I was listening to it, I actually caught it in the car as I was driving to work. And the next story was an interview with an NPR reporter about her latest book. And it was about the famous friends she'd known over the years and the practical jokes they played on each other. And it's like, okay, that's great. There's a place for that. There's a place to speak to those audiences, but there's also, I think, a place to speak to people who are from different audiences in Nashville. And I feel like that's really what we're trying to do as an organization. And so anyway, I just sort of, to wrap things up here, I feel like the root of all these forms of bias, as I said, is not having enough points of view. It's a lack of diversity. And so, we could just throw up our hands in the air and say bias is inevitable. We're going to lean into it. We're going to be this way. We're going to think that. That's one way to do it. I don't think that's really the thing. I think what we as journalists really need to be doing is working against bias, bringing more points of view into the tent, with the idea that when we listen to each other, then with the idea that the person on the other end really has something that we need to know, that has something to say that we can connect with, we're always much better for that. So that's all I had on this. And I do appreciate your time. And I'm happy to answer any questions you all have.
That was very interesting, Chaz. And I appreciate you, taking the time to put together the slides. I'm curious, some of the things that I've observed in the last couple of years with regards to bias is, kind of this proliferation of there seems to be less formal indication of opinion, editorial, and news. They just kind of, especially in the internet resources. In a newspaper, you could look at, turn the page and it's the editorial, and then there's the section called opinions. But you don't even, you don't get that visual cue anymore. And oftentimes you get, particularly on the internet, is, really strident vocal delivery that seems to imply that it's factual, or that it's not a personal opinion, that it's, darn facts, Do you have some thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I do think it's important to trust, to know your source. What is the source of information that's out there? What is their viewpoint in terms of their value? I should say viewpoint, but what are their values really? Are they looking to be an organization that is fair, that is honest, that puts facts first? We as a station have made a decision not to do any editorials. I think so we don't have anybody, we don't do editorials at all as a local station. I don't think anyone has done editorials for NPR since Daniel Shore. And that's been at least a decade since he stopped doing that. I think the more that the NPR has moved away from I mean, there's a lot of analysis, which I think there's a fine line between analysis and opinion. And I think sometimes the line is crossed as a listener, where I feel like someone is maybe giving a little bit more of an opinion than analysis. But the emphasis in intention anyway is to give context, to give analysis, to point out things that maybe aren't immediately apparent, but not to sort of say, here is what you need to think on things. But I think there's a lot of organizations that have no qualms with lying, with just saying things that aren't true. And I mean, that's where I feel like the distrust comes in with the partisan. If you're sort of saying that I'm a partisan outlet, then you give yourself license to only give the parts of the story that support the partisan worldview. And then that erodes trust. And I think that people do, as a whole, see through that. I think it's a very important, that survey is a very important way of seeing the impact of that philosophy in action of like being partisan, like what actually, how people do actually see that in the end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've seen a lot of stuff in the chat and raised hands. Do you want to recognize people, Melissa, please? Thank you.
We've got a question in the chat. I would love your thoughts about Twitter. Do you think journalists should be on Twitter? I.e., do you think that Twitter foments bias just from the very platform that it is? Or what do you tell your journalists about how to use Twitter? And finally, do you think we, the collective we, should be using Twitter as a news source?
I think, again, it's important to know your source and what it is that where their viewpoint is. I mean, it's the old axiom, don't believe everything you read, don't believe everything you hear, don't believe everything that you see on social media. And it amazes me how far we've gotten away from that, where people are really wanting to believe what they already believe and not necessarily stopping and saying like, well, this may not even be truthful. I mean, and this may come from the fact that like people are conditioned to think of what's published as having gone through a gatekeeper, because for so long that was the case, where the things that were just blatantly false were not put out there. And now it's like, if anyone can publish, there's no guardrail on that, Yeah. As for Twitter itself, I use Twitter a lot less than I did when I was a political reporter. When I was a political reporter, I very consciously only used my Twitter profile for giving news about what was happening, particularly at the state capitol. Because there was a lot of interest. There's a small community of people who were very interested in knowing in real time what was happening at the Capitol. And so for them, I was doing, real-time tweeting and things like that. I think that what we have told our journalists is that they should be judicious about what they put on Twitter, that anything factual, anything that's promoting another colleague's work, that kind of thing, we actually use a green light, yellow light, red light system, honestly. Green light, those kinds of things, saying what you're seeing, reporting in real time, green light. What is, promoting a colleague's work, fine. Insulting people, red light. No, don't do that. Don't say anything that could be seen as derogatory towards others. I mean, even if you are even saying like, if you're repeating something that's an accusation against somebody, make sure that you have taken the time to have gotten a response from them before you put it onto social media. That's our ask on that. Because I mean, there are times, I covered the Jeremy Durham scandal. It's like, be slow about putting that stuff out there. Make sure that you've reached out to that person for comment. Because one of the things that they hate the most, if you're on the other end of this, is that something has come out, regardless of media, that they hate the idea of they haven't been given a chance to give their side. And I think in the yellow light zone is like we've said is that it is okay for you to talk about your lived experience. And this is kind of where we get into the diversity of viewpoints and combating and not letting the majority viewpoint of like what should and shouldn't be said, or the white decision maker opinion decide everything. It's like, if you're a person of color, you want to talk about your experience with racism, fine, you can do that. Talk about your own direct experience. Don't necessarily generalize or be cautious about generalizing, but also ask yourself, like, is that really what you want to do? Because when you put something out in the public sphere like that, it may be allowable, but it may not be wise. And know that like not every person on Twitter has good intentions. And they're gonna come after you if they may use this against you as a journalist. But so to go back to what I was saying earlier, it's like I think it's very important for journalists to be very clear about what they're doing with Twitter. There's some who are more opinion. That's fine if the people are if their job is to be opinion. I think we as Twitter users can vet that. I'll say the last thing is I'm also very limited in who I follow on Twitter. I just sort of I need to know them personally, and you personally or professionally or in some way really know that there's someone I can trust. And even and as a just to, and before I retweet anything, I ask myself, do I know this to be true?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. So Curtis, I think you have a question for Chaz.
Yeah, I do. I deal in one of my principal focuses in retirement is on climate change. And one of the problems I think the press has is in reporting, being completely neutral in reporting the science of it. And I find that because many times it appears to me that in reporting and putting on a debate among people who may still deny or object to various parts of the science, you, in effect, by giving equal weight to it or equal time to it, you might provide the idea that it's not settled, or that the majority of people that deal in, say, the science space are of one opinion versus the opinion of the other. And while I think it's very important that the present both sides, how do you deal with this nuance of trying to indicate to the audience that this person who objects is really part of just a very small minority? It becomes very important when you have influential publications like the Wall Street Journal, whose editorial staff uses this to their advantage.
Right.
It calls upon people who have really been on their editorial page, for example, who've been largely discredited in the real science going on. So I've asked a relatively broad question, but how do you do that?
Well, I mean, I don't think we give equal time. Simply put, I mean, I don't think we give equal weight to climate change deniers and climate scientists. I think we give. I mean, I think if you were to look at the percentage of if you were to do an analysis, I think you would find that we're probably 90% in favor towards climate scientists, the consensus of climate scientists. And if it's 10%, it's a lot of it is the response. TVA giving a response, for instance, sometimes could be seen as yeah, I wouldn't say they're even climate deniers there. Yeah, it's like I'm trying to think like what's the other side. A lot of our focus. I say this because a lot of our focus especially of our environmental reporter has been on the TVA and on natural gas. The idea of putting in a fossil fuel plant, having more natural gas plants to replace the coal plants that they're retiring, and whether they should be doing something more like nuclear, more solar, more wind. And I would say, if anything, we need to, as an editor, I am pushing them to put a little bit more of the other side in, to the story, and being a little more open to the other side. Because I do think like there are some subtle nuances of like whether nuclear is really the way to go, or, how available is solar in Tennessee, that kind of stuff that kind of come in. So I can't really answer for the Wall Street Journal. And I think it's important to sort of like, as I said earlier, like to think about the source and what their goals are. The Wall Street Journal, as you saw, was way up on that list. I think a lot of that's the perception of the business pages. Then people aren't really even thinking about the editorial pages. They're saying like, well, what happens with the stock market, whether it goes up or goes down, that's a neutral, that's just facts, So I see them as a trustworthy source. So they're just telling me what's happening with the stock market. Same thing with the Weather Channel. It's like, oh, the Weather Channel is not biased because they're just telling me what the weather is. But of course, they've been leaning into climate change as a topic of focus, as a focal topic. So, and it's like they can use that platform of being neutral messengers to bring that message to them. So go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I understand where you're coming from
Yeah.
on this. And so your basic response is that it's the duty of the recipient to understand if there's bias in the message.
No, I don't think that's true. I think it's the duty of us in the media to be judicious about who we give platforms to.
Okay.
And when we give them a platform, to be clear on their motives and what they do. And to say if they're a minority point of view within science, if it's, I can't think of an example of this, but off the top of my head, but if there's someone who is saying something that's contrary to most of science, to make that clear to people. And I feel like NPR does this very well. I mean, that's that's part of why I work here, is I feel like as a network, the commitment is to objectivity, to putting facts first, to letting people make up their own minds. But part of letting people make up their own minds is being responsible in terms of what facts you put forward. You can't, you don't, as I said, honesty, integrity, these are the values that we have. And if someone is being honest or or not demonstrating integrity, then they're not someone we necessarily need to have on the air.
Yeah. So it kind of brings to mind a phrase that's used all too often in the last couple of years. Many people are saying,
Right.
which, so I think that the kernel of Chaz's statement here is that we all have our own responsibility as well to, as Curtis pointed out, to interpret, the reliability of some sources, but also that we, are entrusting some of our news resources to also help the public out with not giving airtime to notably not factual viewpoints or distinctly minority views. So that one of the questions in the chat is, what can a member of the public do about clearly biased or even false items published on social media? Now, I know that's kind of outside of the realm of WPLN, but do you have some thoughts about, where can there be constructive pushback on false information?
Well, that's a tough one. The algorithms, they reward engagement, good or bad, typically. So, you'd like to say, that jumping in and saying that's not true is actually going to be productive, but it actually may be counterproductive. And that is part of where I've started to use Twitter less and less. I don't use Facebook for opinion at all. And my own personal profile is actually private. I just use it for, friends and very close friends and family. Same with Instagram. I think that this is a challenge for social media companies to evolve into credible platforms. And I don't know, I just think as consumers, maybe we just don't use them as much as the ultimate solution. I mean, they are businesses and they make money off of engagement. So within the world of those social media platforms, I don't know that there's a great way to combat false information. I wish I wish I knew any answer on that one.
Yeah. So there's that's kind of a natural segue to the next question in the chat is, this umbrella of social media, radio, newspapers, internet programs, podcasts, things like that. When people blame the media, and this typically comes out as a sweeping generalization, the media meaning all of those different types of platforms.
Right.
When people blame the media as being bad, does that, what are your personal thoughts on that? How does that affect you and people in your newsroom?
It's certainly not pleasant. So, I mean, I have relatives who blame the media, and I just say, you do realize I am the media. Like you are literally talking about me. Like I am the person you are talking about. And if you're not talking about me, you are talking about people I've worked with, friends, friends generally. So, so it's like, it's hard. I think it's easy to, it's maybe a human nature to sort of say, all lawyers are this way, all journalists are this way, all, people in this profession are this way. I mean, it's a form of bias, and it's hard to, all I can do is usually what I say is to sort of, is that I can only answer for our own actions as an organization, and if someone starts to criticize the media, I'll say, well, look, all I can say is this is how we approach it. This is how I approach it as an editor. And the editors that I respect approach it the same way. Or maybe they don't, maybe they've got better ideas and they approach it differently, and I try to borrow from them. But that's you know, that's the standards of, it's a, you know, journalism, it's like I said, it's a very broad term. To me, being a journalist is about committing to a certain set of principles. And it's a voluntary commitment. I mean, there's no licensing for journalists in America as opposed to, say, lawyers and doctors. But, you know, that is a difference, you know, between sort of, there's an enforcement mechanism for, theoretically, for lawyers and doctors who, you know, violate the principles of their profession. And there is no real enforcement mechanism for journalists other than what we're starting to see, which is libel law. And some of these things that people have been getting away with that are blatantly libelous, they're actually starting to pay a price for it. And that is actually a very, I will say that's a very controversial, there's a lot of, you know, mixed feelings about that in journalism, because usually it's like, you know, you see usually when things like that happen, when the state cracks down on bad journalistic practices, it eventually, you know, starts to be used to shut down good journalism. You know, so there is a wariness of that, but it's there are some lines in our society, and you know, I think that and there are some lines within journalism that you don't want to be crossed. I feel like I can't remember what the original question was now, so I'm sorry if I've gone off topic a little bit.
So do we have any questions that people want to say out loud, or should I take the back? Anybody stands there? Okay, so now we get to the part where we always say, so what can the League of Women Voters
Debbie.
do for?
Yeah, I do see a couple more questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So I appreciate the fact, Chaz, that you talked about the diversity in the newsroom and how important it is to get different perspectives. But I also wonder if there's a point at which you feel apologetic for saying, as somebody not of color, I'm not capable of covering a story. Is that a challenge in the newsroom to try and balance that kind of feeling?
The answer is yes, that is a challenge. I think that there's a few different points you made on that. I mean, certainly there are things that as you know, a person, as a white person, I feel like I'm not going to have the full perspective on. And that's where it's important to collaborate with other people. I mean, sort of, you know, reaching out to my colleague who was Latina and asking her, okay, what do you think of this? I think can be very helpful. And the challenge, though, as a leader in the organization is like to build that culture of collaboration where people are asking those things, where people who, you know, are white are asking people of color, and also it's just not to be treated everyone of color uniformly. I mean, everyone has different experiences. And one of the real burdens that people of color often feel is that they're asked to give that advice a lot. And you have to be careful not to do that too much either. So it's kind of like it becomes easier the more people you have at the table. You know, like, I mean, really what we aim for is a newsroom that reflects America, that reflects Nashville in Middle Tennessee, you know, and that's a long project. It's gonna take a lot of time to do that. And when you get to that point, then these things sort themselves out pretty easily. I'm going to just give it a quick example. Going back to the Black Lives Matter protests a few years ago, we had reporters of color who said, send me to this. I want to cover this topic. We had reporters of color who said, absolutely do not send me to this under any circumstances to cover these protests. It's just too triggering. I don't use that word, but that's really what they were getting at. And eventually some of the reporters who said, don't send me, came around to saying, I want to go to help my other colleagues. I appreciate you didn't send me in the beginning, but as these things go along, I see that it's taking a toll on the others and I want to go, I want to give some perspective. And we had, you know, journalists who are white who said, you know, I don't understand some things here. I want other colleagues who are people of color to be going with me. We always, as a safety matter, sent at least 2 people to all of them. And, you know, at the beginning, you know, me, at the time there was really just 2 of us who were leading the newsroom. It was me and the former news director. You know, we talked about what we're going to do. And rather than sort of go to everyone individual and say, do you want to do this? Do you want to do this? And we said, okay, look, regardless of what your race is, regardless of what your ethnicity is, regardless of how you feel about the police, whatever, just tell us, do you want to go or not? And it's not a decision forever. We'll come back next time there's a protest, we'll do it all over again. And, you know, we can talk about why you want to go, why you don't want to go. It'll help us make decisions in the future about whether to ask you or not. But, you know, you just have to say yes or no. So I think like I hope that answers your question. It's like, you know, you have to sort of, I mean, you got to think about people as individuals and, you know, and so it's like, am I qualified to cover this or not? I mean, that's an individual question. It's really not one of like your race. It's one about sort of your background and whether you know and who you can ask for to answer the questions that you haven't even thought of.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Anyone else with a raised hand?
I see Karen McIntyre has her hand up.
Just hold me again.
Hi, Chaz. Thank you so much for this. It was very informative. And I listen to you guys all day long when I'm driving around in traffic in Nashville. And I get a lot of my news from public television, the Tennessee Lookout, the Tennessean, not as much anymore because it's not as serious a paper as it used to be. But I am part of a group that's been working for over a year to try to get Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools become sustainable. And they promised they would do this, but that was sort of greenwashing. And we have tried repeatedly to find ways to get coverage. And we get crickets from all of the news outlets. And I'm wondering, because that's something I've noticed, is how do you decide what becomes newsworthy, but how does one reach out in a way that's effective in getting good news coverage so that we can make change in our world?
Well, I appreciate you bringing that up. You know, I mean, I will say I'm not aware of that effort. So I don't know that I've ever said yes or no on a story on that. I don't know that any of my colleagues have ever said yes or no on a story on that. So, well, I was going to say, I'm not, go ahead, please. I know you're going to say you reached out to us, right? Go ahead.
I've reached out to your environmental reporter several times. I've reached out to Khalil Al-Kalona for This Is Nashville. I don't even know who to send information to at this point. Right. We have a three-month series running in the Tennessean, the Sierra Club newspaper, about what we have done and what we've been involved in. But I from the local outlets, I've gotten nowhere. So I don't know who to reach out to, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was going to say that, I mean, definitely reaching out to Caroline is a good idea as our environmental reporter. You may want to reach out to Alexis Marshall, who's our new, she's fairly recent, our education reporter. We get a lot of pitches. I'm sorry to say that's I see 500 a day. I mean, is that an exaggeration? Well, that's probably a little bit of exaggeration. I get about 200 emails a day. Many of them are pitches, you know? So it's like, and I make a decision usually within about 2 minutes. Well, not even that. I make a decision in about 30 seconds on whether it's something that I can forward or not. And it's just like, I just don't have, you know, there's just so many things that are coming our way. So it's hard. So it's like, I'm sure there are a lot of worthy stories that get ignored. You know, and so I think there's a little bit of background noise on there. Thanks. So anyway, so it's like, sorry. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's intriguing to me what you're saying. So, I mean, I would say if you could send me an email, I can take a look at it, forward it to Lexi and see what she thinks. You know, Caroline, I will say one thing that we have to do as a newsroom, and we only have 6 reporters, which is well more than when I started. There were only 3 of us at that time. And we also have the show, which has its own team. So we've got a lot more capacity than we used to. But with Caroline, it's like we've really said, like with every reporter, we've said, what is the thing we're really going to focus on? And with Caroline, it is very much TVA and climate change. So, I mean, I hear that the sustainability aspect of it really fits into that climate change aspect of it, but TVA has really been her focus. And I do think that's just because it is the biggest energy producer in the region, it just has to be. So we have to make decisions like that. It's like, okay, what is our focus area? And then there is sometimes there is time to do other things outside of those focus areas, but every reporter has sort of like, this is what they're doing. This is like really where we want the energy to go into. But yeah, please do send me that email. I believe if the email should be, I know I provided it when I got on the Zoom call, but if you want to send me an email, it's my first initial and last name at WPLN.org.
So one more question, Chaz, and this kind of maybe relates a little bit, when we talk about things happening in Metro Nashville and WPLN being one of the resources here, based on economics and support for a public radio station. So I wonder, the question in the chat is, how do you, in general, I think, how do we expand coverage geographically to represent, it kind of goes to the heart of like diversity in thought too. And how do, those people who are in areas that are very, remote or rural,
right,
who have very important issues to them, but they don't, because of their, the size or the location, don't have that voice that is primarily focused on our cities, which creates kind of this cycle about, well, it's only about, the urban areas and they're out of touch with the rural areas.
I'm very sensitive to that. I grew up in rural South Carolina, and I did not grow up listening to public radio. I was only dimly aware of it until I got into college. So I definitely hear that. As our growth plan, a big part of our growth plan has been expanding to become more regional in our coverage. That's why, like, environmental is actually a beat that we added with the idea that it would be about, all of Middle Tennessee, all of Tennessee. I mean, really globally in a way. And that actually came from what we were hearing when we did listening sessions outside of Nashville, is we heard environmental coverage as being like the thing that people wanted more of the most. So, so that's also part of Caroline's marching orders, is think about things that are broad in terms of scope. So like TVA, I guess, again, is it being something that affects the entire region. So that is sort of, I think, when she's making her decisions about which stories to pitch us, that's part of what she's thinking there. So that's, and just to add to that, I mean, the next beat we want to add is a regional reporter, somebody who is explicitly not covering Nashville. And that's with the idea of like, we need somebody who's finding stories outside of Nashville. Damon, who I mentioned earlier, I mean, he had some of this. He was kind of, we called him our enterprise reporter. He had a lot of flexibility in what he was doing, and was doing a lot of things that were. He's actually just left us over the summer, but he was doing things like he was leading our coverage of Waverly and the rebuilding in Waverly. He was doing a lot of coverage of higher education, so he was covering MTSU. He was covering Tennessee Tech. He was getting outside of the region a little bit more, but we want somebody who's I think full-time really focused on finding the issues that are of importance in a lot of different communities around Middle Tennessee and drawing some of those threads together.
Great. Well, thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us. Karen, you have one more question? You're on mute.
No. Katie, would you like to ask your question? I need 1 minute.
Okay.
So you take 4, Katie, you can have them. Nope. Okay.
I've got time. I've got until 1 o'clock if you guys want to.
Okay. Well, what I'm going to, okay. That's what, 5 minutes. See, so I need 1. So before people need to leave, one of the things that you do know is that Melissa and I are co-chairs of the Hot Topics, and Melissa brought Chaz. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you very much, Chaz. You've been great. I think I think we did pretty well so far, Melissa, just saying. So because I have been asked by many folk in the group, we will be having a speaker talking about the libraries. So Lindsay Kimmery, who's the coordinator for library services at Metro Nashville Schools, is going to be speaking next hot topic. And she'll be discussing lots of things which I think are pretty important, particularly for many of us who are concerned about what's in our schools and what's in our libraries and how the librarians, it turns out, are kind of on the they're in the middle of a lot of stuff. And I will say that in this conversation, there is a difference between, for example, the Nashville Public Library versus the librarians for the school systems. And that actually, as it moved forward, I don't know if you all had it. I had a t-shirt that said, you know, I read banned books, which came from, that actually is not the same group as the group that will be speaking next. Not the same, from the same perspective as the group speaking, as Lindsay will be bringing from in next month rather, February 3rd. So I clearly had that well organized in my head as I brought it up. But I did want everyone to know that we will be discussing libraries next time. And Katie, he said he'll hang, so go for it.
I was just curious because you were talking about the number of emails you get that are pitches, and you give about 30 seconds to decide whether you're going to click on it or not. What are the things that catch your eye? You know, what are the things that you're looking for that'll grab you and make you want to look at it?
I will say a lot of them I can tell at a glance are not local to Nashville, that they are just, you know, if they seem like they're coming from some PR firm that's out of state, I very rarely will give it much attention. I will say one pitch that caught my eye yesterday was, and it was from an out of state. They actually somehow knew something about Nashville. They talked about the deep freeze and how all the bushes are brown. Mm-hmm. And I was like already thinking about this. This pitch came in. And I said, that's a good idea. We're not going to call that person, but that's a good idea. And then Gardens of Babylon the next day, this morning, sent an email, the same thing. And it's like, okay, that's probably more who we're going to do. So someone local is important. So I think a pitch that like is very clearly from someone in our community is important. That's the first criteria. The second criterion I would say is, just something that has some impact beyond just this one thing, and that's like, and I think topicality, I mean, to some degree, maybe it's this big story bias. It's like, it needs to be topical in some way. I need to be sort of looking for something that, I think it has to be,
any catchy words or
no.
No, okay.
No, I wish no, there's no catchy words. I will say if it's hard to follow and badly formatted, it's less likely to get, just because I did just the time. It's just like, it's hard to follow. But I mean, it's like, I think just a straightforward email that's very simple, personal, is about something that is relevant to people in Nashville. I mean, that's really what we're looking for. And a lot of times it's like, probably what I'll do with it in those 30 seconds. And it's like, okay, this might be something here. And I'll forward it to a reporter and say, take a look at this, see whether you think there's something to this, and then they're going to pitch it to their editor, and then it's going to they're going to make the decision ultimately. And because I can't, as the senior person in the newsroom, it would be really easy for me to say, hey, do this, do that, do that. But that's going to get into that bias I talked about like the white male making the decisions based on what they think is interesting. And I don't want to do that. I want to send it to my reporters. I want them to use their judgment. And then I want them to work with their editors to decide on what the priority is going to be based on this broad parameters that we've set as a newsroom, and sort of strategically said, we want more regional coverage. We want topics that span that are in these focus areas. So that's kind of where I come in, is like, is this, and that's kind of what I'm asking myself, is this going to fit into those areas? And if I feel like there is some bit of that, then I'll forward it along. So,
Okay.
but I, you know, honestly, I will say the most important thing is, if you want to reach a reporter is getting to know them, building a relationship, that kind of thing. And don't rely so much on just like sending an email and expecting that that there's, like I said, the decision making is often so quick and there's so many demands for time
Right.
on the air that's like we just can't get it right every single time.
Right. And so few people do you have to.
Yeah. Well, and there is a final thing to say. I know we're running out of time, but like there are many fewer journalists than there were even 10 years ago, especially at the local level. I think I read the other day that the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times combined employ more journalists than every local paper in the country combined.
Right.
Something like that. It's like it's become very focused on a few organizations, and that's the danger of like the internet being everywhere all at once, is that, you know, and people are gravitating towards just these big sources. You know, NPR has luckily been one of those, and NPR is very locally based. But that is the danger. So anyway, I'm happy to stay longer if you guys. I have a few more minutes if people want to talk longer, or if Karen wants to end the call now, I'm happy to do that too.
I want to say something, which is that This Is Nashville is great. I don't know how you
glad to hear that.
to put that together, but it's like it's coming up on its 1 year anniversary, I think.
1 year anniversary is March 1st, I believe. Yes.
Okay, it's fantastic. It's great. As I suggested, possibly This Is Not Nashville is a great podcast. Running somebody around. I mean,
well,
yin yang.
That's an interesting idea. The title, no, I will say in all seriousness, some discussion was had. Do we want to have the show have Nashville in the title?
Yeah.
There was that this is where the business side comes in. They did find that having Nashville in the title was going to be better for the brand of the show.
Yeah,
so you know, but it's like there is this constant tension of like how much of it is really just about Nashville. I think as a show they do a great job of getting well beyond Davidson County. You know, like the Promised Land episode where they were talking about Promised Land, Tennessee, which is I think in Cheatham or Dixon County. I had no idea. They had a great one on Sumner County, the Black State Fair. So
yeah, I think that you will expand, and you may end up either having to change the name or have a sister podcast or whatever.
Maybe. Yeah. That would be great. That would be great. Yeah.
It's one of the just having come from elsewhere and been very involved in like the big, you know, like the Philadelphia, San Francisco, Los Angeles markets. I wasn't thrilled by some of the programming, but This Is Nashville is like really good. I mean, you've done some really nice little episodic things, which I think are very useful and very good. And I don't know if your plan is to do that. I don't really know what the market is for those kinds of things any longer, given how many episodic little things there are out there in podcast land. But something that shows up what is it? It's at noon, right? Every day.
Yeah, and it is available as a podcast for download. Yes. Yeah, but at noon every day we do it. Yeah, and I will say that part is outside because I'm the senior editor. I'm part of the other team, the news desk team. The executive producer of that's Andrea Tudhope. She deserves almost all the credit for that. I mean, the only part that I was involved in was like in the planning for the show before we hired Andrea was like being involved in that. So, but yeah, there was a real there was a lot of listening to shows around the country and really trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And I do think that what really works with that show is again some of this intentionality that we talked about like having. Like one thing that they are very good about, we both sides, you know, all the newsroom is we do track our sourcing. Who are we talking to in terms of race, ethnicity, location? Are they from Davidson County or not? And gender and gender diversity, we track that too. And you know, when we find that we're sort of over in one area or another, like we don't say like, okay, let's go get a person of color to be an expert on this topic that we've chosen. We start to say like, what topics can we be covering that will bring us into that community more, you know? And because I think a lot of times and then that involves what the show does really well, because they've got the time to do this, is they will go to those communities and say, what are the topics on your mind, you know, in this community? Like if we feel like we're not getting enough people who are Middle Eastern, like go to the Kurdish community. What are the things you want to talk, like you think are important? And then that'll lead to some things that we haven't really thought about. Like a great example is this Curious Nashville we did on Arabic driver's exams. You know, like not on our radar at all, but by going to the courage community and say, well, what's on your mind? It's like, you know, we can't get a driver's exam. Some of these people, some of the people in our community, and they need to know how to drive. They know how to drive. They can't get a license because they can't get the exam. And that's where you sort of like, that's where that's where sort of these things about, like I was saying earlier, about like getting outside of groupthink and getting outside of like your own bubble in terms of decision making. Like that's where, and being connected with your community so that you're not just like chasing whatever you think is the big story, but chasing the story that people in your community are really thinking about. That's where that kind of comes in. So
yeah, I think it's a great group of people that can also filter back up to you and like what is on the minds of people.
Right. Right. I mean, being engaged with community, that is the one of the things we look for most when we are hiring people. And I was talking about this with in our building. It's like, you know, I've been here long enough that just about everybody in our newsroom I was here for the hiring of, and I know what their interview questions were, and I know that part of our interview process is making sure they're a person who knows how to engage the community, and not just sort of like, and knows how to like turn the story over to the community and say, like, instead of like, oh, I thought this was interesting, I went to that community and I told the story. It's like, I went to the community, I found out what they were interested in, and I did this story as a result. Or I sort of, you know, I facilitated this story as a result. Like I got them onto a program where they could talk about it. Like that's really what we're looking for when we're trying to hire people. And I think once you sort of have that mindset, that's what community journalism really is. It's about sort of building connection with the community. And yeah, that's why I think the NPR model works so well, is because like we are local stations working, we live and work in our communities. And so we're sort of saying, we say to NPR, these are the stories that you need to be talking about. So.
I have to go.
Okay.
All right.
And if Karen wants to email me, or if you can talk, it's either way. I'm fine.
It's not about that. It's not about that. I just want to echo how wonderful that program is.
Oh,
but and I'm going to offer you the opportunity, as I'm a librarian, but I bet there'd be a librarian who would volunteer to index the material, because I was looking for one of the podcasts just today and couldn't find it easily.
Oh, no.
So yeah, so you know, indexing things, making them, yeah, okay, making them accessible so you can go back would be wonderful. So just a suggestion, and somebody will do that for you for free, Chaz, I'm sure. But it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Well, that's really good feedback. Yeah, I mean, we are, as a small shop, we're running our own web, and I'm wondering what was the episode you were looking for? Can you just tell me, and we could maybe figure out what the problem was that didn't.
Well, just the last few days, you had somebody talking, a woman who was talking about, oh gosh, now I can't even remember, but I was looking for it earlier today and I couldn't find it. It was just this week, and it just didn't pop up when I was looking. So I was thinking, so many times that's a real issue. You know, one of the wonderful things about the way the universe was organized when there was adequate vetting was the indexability of things. You could go to a newspaper index and those kinds of things, but there are ways to do that. So I was thinking, you know, maybe you could contact Ann Air Salon would be good at that. She's one of the members of this group. She's a librarian who's retired from Vanderbilt. There are a number of them out there that I bet would do this for you, that would help you out.
Categorization, watch out. Woo!
Well, yeah, you're getting outside my area of expertise for sure, but organizing content so that it's findable later online is amazingly hard. I mean, we have trouble ourselves. And this is, you know, our web team is really one person, and he is good. But we are constantly finding ways in which the indexing is broken, and something that we know is there is not easy for us to find ourselves. So
reach into the choir, Chaz.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying, and I just don't. I will. I'll mention that. I'll mention that to Andrea. Okay. I'll mention that to our digital team about sort of like, could we call on some volunteers to help us with some of the indexing, not only of the show, I think of the website in general. You know.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I just like that you still have an RSS link. Thank you. I know I'm an old fart, but you know, I still use a newsreader that, you know, pulls in RSS links.
I've never been an RSS user myself, so I don't know much about that, but I know that it is an important part of our it's actually how we generate our daily newsletter. is the RSS feed. So that is part of why it's still part of it,
Good feed.
is we are using it in different ways. We're using it, continuing to use it, is what I should
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Just as a completely weird, wacko, nerdy thing to say. So any other since he's still here, anybody? I think Melissa had to pop off. She often does. She has a real job. Some of us don't. Or at least I don't. I don't know about y'all. Chaz, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the invitation and I appreciate your patience with me. So it's been good meeting you all.
Yeah. And I will just add, I know that, TVA is a big deal. I really appreciate immensely that you're focusing on TVA. And I will say the other thing that is going to be, I think, increasingly an issue, because it is certainly in Middle Tennessee, but also up in Bristol in our trash. And as I'm sure you know, but
right.
if she focuses more on trash, because trash in our landfills, and I mean, I always thought we had a real trouble here in Middle Tennessee because of Middle Point and whatever.
Right.
And I found out about Bristol and I went, oh man, well, we are nowhere.
Bristol, Tennessee.
Bristol, Tennessee has a landfill between Bristol, Tennessee, and then across the border, I think it's called Bristol, Virginia as well. And they have a horrible, horrific experience right now. I mean, if they'll have to pump in perpetuity to ensure that horrible toxic stuff doesn't get into their water supply. So it's because it's across states.
Right.
Yeah. So
I'll mention that to Caroline. That does fit in. Well, Middle Point, I guess you maybe heard about the biofuel decision they made last night. I mean, that's definitely, in terms of topicality, that's something that she's going to be looking into the next couple of days, how to advance that story in the next few days. But waterways, in addition to TVA, waterways, when she interviewed, the two topics I was most impressed about with her that she knew a lot about were TVA and waterways.
Yeah. Well, TVA is messing with our waterways. So
they're not. I hear you.
Well.
I hear you. Yeah, and I had covered the mega site in West Tennessee, the one where I don't even know what they're doing with it now, but I remember the big issue there was, what are they going to do with the wastewater? How do they fix the wastewater issue? Right. And that is such an issue. And so anyway, so it's like, so yeah, that's like I said, with the environmental beat, it's like, that was part of what people were telling us. It was like, they were really concerned about their waterways. And so when we went to hire an environmental reporter, we looked for somebody who knew about waterways. So,
good job. And I will say that because of where you're at, and since it is a federal, it would seem to me that focusing somehow and moving TVA and getting monies from outside, and also programs that would go beyond Tennessee, would be great. I mean, when I ever ask people, most people just think of TVA and they think, oh, we don't spend very much money on our electricity, which is actually true in comparison to a lot of places. But the question is why, and under what circumstances, and who controls it. And so I just think it would be fantastic if you all figured out a way to up your position in what you do, and find a way to pop up to the level of, Terry Gross, well, not that far, but you know what I mean, right? Which is it, because we are like at the heart of a federal program and a federal agency that really does need a little bit of hitting upside the head moving forward. So, or not, depending upon
accountability. What we think of it is
scrutiny. I'm biased. I'm not.
Well, I'm just saying, like, yeah. I mean, I don't mean that at all, but I'm just saying we do value accountability, and it is a public agency, or even a private company. We want accountability for. And
we're right at the heart of it. So I think it would be fantastic if you all moved forward and did that. Just saying. Right. And not like you need to find yet another way of spending money, because of course you don't have it. But just saying, it would be great. I'd support it.
Yeah. I appreciate that feedback. That's good. Thank you.
Bye, y'all. I think, is Tracy still able to turn this off? Are you here, Tracy? Maybe.
Yeah, about to end it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Chaz. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.